Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Thank you. I feel like I can't step in the middle of this glorious shrine. But I'm so excited to welcome all of you this evening. My name's Andrew Westover, and I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storza Director of Education here at the High Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's program is in conjunction with the exhibition Monir Farmanfarmaian, A Mirror Garden, which is, of course, located upstairs on the second floor. I would like to remind everyone that this exhibition will remain open after hours after this program for those who would like to enjoy it this evening. This exhibition is made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines, ACT Foundation, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Louise Sams and Jerome Grillot, Henry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, Robin and Hilton Howell, and our other sponsors as well. Before we begin, I would also like to thank High Museum members who are in attendance tonight. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of tonight's program. And I will now invite the High's esteemed curator, Michael Rooks, to begin this evening's program. Michael.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I wasn't going to use a mic, but this is much better. I don't have to yell at you this evening. It's really my privilege to introduce tonight's honored guest, who is also, you'll find, is a lender to the exhibition. Monir Farmanfarmaian, A Mirror Garden. But not only has Zara Houshmand lent a work of art to our exhibition, but she has also lent the exhibition its title, which I am enormously grateful for. Thank you so much, Zara. Ms. Houshmand is an Iranian American writer whose work bridges cultural divides and includes poetry, memoir, theater, and literary translation. She's also a visual artist who is among those pioneers of virtual reality as a new medium in contemporary art. Her VR installation called Beyond Manzanar, which refers to the site of a Japanese concentration camp in Northern California, allows its audience to share in the first-person experience of oppression and incarceration of ethnic minorities who have been scapegoated during times of geopolitical conflict. And interestingly, and germane to the exhibition and perhaps to tonight's program, in the center of this virtual reality installation is a garden that Zara has described, quote, as an ancient form of virtual reality, an image of paradise created as a refuge from the outside world, unquote. Houshmand's early translations of Bijan Mofid's plays led to her own work as a playwright, most notably The Future Ain't What It Used to Be, which is a great title, which was produced by the Burbage Theater in Los Angeles, and in 2 decades as editor for the Mind and Life Institute, which was founded by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Charlottesville, Virginia. Houshmand has contributed to the widespread dissemination of ideas emanating from the rich dialogue between Buddhism and Western science, by way of the Dalai Lama's interest in and engagement with scientific theory. Her most recent book, Moon and Sun, published in 2020, is a bilingual Persian and English edition of her own translations of the 13th century poet Rumi's Rubaiyat, or quatrains, that is, poems that consist of 4 lines and they have their mathematical logic. Her collaborative writings include Running Toward Mystery, The Adventure of an Unconventional Life with the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, and it was published by Random House in 2020. Of course, A Mirror Garden, which she co-authored with the artist Monir Farmanfarmaian, published by Knopf in 2007. So, tonight we have a very special privilege of hearing Zara Houshmand read from A Mirror Garden. And so with that, please give a warm welcome to our special guest, Zara Houshmand.
I'm going to be talking about my experience working with Monir on her memoir and how I got to know her. And the memoir is on the experience of her development as an artist, because I think that's what made me most interested in seeing the connection with the exhibition. But I have to say there's so much more in it too. She asked me to help her with the story, and she made a big secret of it. I had known her casually at a slight distance for maybe 10, 15 years before she asked me. I was living in Iran in the early 70s, mid-70s, and working with a group of photographers. And one of the photographers was a very close friend of hers who traveled with her and photographed many of the discoveries that she was making in terms of folk art and tribal arts, and also photographed her work. And I was working with him, and I was traveling the country with this group of photographers separately, and he would often say, let me show you what Monir showed me last week. And so we were kind of trailing along, and so many of the things that she describes were things I experienced also just a couple of steps behind her. So a lot of what I was doing in the writing was descriptions of my impressions firsthand that were descriptions of what she was giving me. And the reason for all of that was because Monir in her presence, and you may have caught a glimpse of this in the film upstairs, she has just this incredible expressiveness and presence and vibrancy, and in any group she is the center of attention, and she's commanding attention and telling stories, and just so alive. And yet, when you record your stories and transcribe them, it comes off as completely flat. And it's like, what's going on here? So much of the story value was in her delivery. And as a writer, it's like, what do I do with this? How do I find a way of expressing? And so I was very much leaning on my experiences. She has an absolutely perfect photographic memory, and she will describe scenes from early childhood in great detail, her responses to the art around her, the traditional art that she lived with, and the perfection of creating a visual picture in words was there. But it was very, very hard to get her to talk about interior experience. And somehow an American reading audience needs that. And so these were the challenges that I was dealing with. And so I was also I was drawing from my experience, my knowledge of her, my opportunities to observe her in action over many, many years. And so it became very much a collaboration. And not only was she not a writer, she wasn't a reader. And so when I would write a chapter and I would read it back to her over the phone for her feedback, and she might pick on a couple of details that I've gotten factually, but beyond that, there was never any feedback. It was like, that's your art. You're the artist in words. I'm the artist in visual things, and we will work together, and I will trust you. And so it was quite remarkable, that level of trust and faith, and it freed me up a lot to be as creative as I could, because I had to tell myself, how do I capture that liveliness of voice that doesn't come through the transcripts? I have to write as if she was a writer. How would she? And so that's what I was working with. She also, when she asked me to work with her, she presented it as a big secret. She didn't want anybody to know that we were working on this book until it was completely done. because she had a terrible fear of that she would be shamed, that people would make fun of her, thinking she was so important that why should she write a memoir? And we had the same kind of imposter syndrome that I think many women have. And that lasted throughout her life, even in spite of the tremendous self-confidence of her art and social presence. So the book was a secret until it was published. And that meant that I could not approach her as a journalist, fact-checking, getting other points of view. All I had was what she gave me and my own memories of the prom. And so that's how it came to be. The business of her photographic memory, she was born into an old Iran that doesn't exist anymore, and trying to recreate that sense of the richness of the life. And I'm going to give you just a sample of the kind of descriptions from early childhood, where she's hiding a treasure from a story. I hid my hard-earned treasure in the basement storeroom next to the kitchen, where so many other treasures were stored. It would hardly be noticed by jealous brothers there. The jars of pickles, quinces in syrup, and petals suspended in jam captured the few dusty rays of underground light glowing like jewels. There were huge trays of golden baklava and cookies baked in batches big enough to last for months. My mother's precious bowls of deep pink crystals stood by, ready to be filled the moment guests arrived. The storeroom was stretched under half the house. The most wonderful spot in the whole room was the floating bed, where the bread was kept safe from mice and bugs. A platform as big as a boat hung from the ceiling by 4 thick wires, a swing beyond imagine. I balanced on the ladder and stepped across space. Swaying on the edge, I surveyed my kingdom. It was autumn, and a city of giant beehives was growing from the ground below me. Ceramic rings, wide enough at the bottom for 2 men to stand inside, were stacked into conical towers and filled layer by layer as the harvest came in. One tower held chickpeas, another one lentils, another almonds, another pistachios. A little door in the bottom ring dispensed a day's measure onto the cook's brass tray, and each one had its own sound, from the shushing lentils fitted for soup to the snappy clatter of pistachios. I knew that the tower's nuts were only a fraction of what orchards produced in the villages surrounding Vazmin. I had climbed up mountains of pistachios and rolled in avalanches while the workers rubbed off the red and green skins and sorted this pile for roasting and that to be ground up for baklava, and sacks to be sewn up and sent off to us. Just a glimpse into the life of a wealthy but provincial family of my mother's generation, and the sensual pleasure and treasures that were just part of everyday life. I think it's worth noticing that even though this was an old Iran, and we follow the news now and see what people are struggling over, her mother was very famous and proud for having refused the arranged marriage that her parents set up for her. Her father was born into a very religious family. His grandfather was an Ayatollah. And he had a crisis of faith at his mother's death. And he turned him totally against Islam. He became a progressive politician and champion of girls' education. So this was, again, my grandparents' generation. I'm not young. At the same time, probably the strongest figure in her life, in a cultural aspect in her childhood, was her Uncle Darvish, Daya Darvish, who was a Sufi and a wandering dervish and eccentric, but he carry the values that are there very much in Iranian culture, that are spiritual, quite separate from religious. And in this world, she starts taking drawing lessons as a child after the death of her sister. I will read you a little bit of her first experience with art, creating art. I sit erect at the dining room table. Mr. Mossavari sits beside me, and beyond him are 6 empty, stiff-backed chairs dressed in red velvet flowers. Mr. Mossavari is middle-aged and a little chubby, with a gentle voice and warm smile. When he hands me another pencil, his fingers rest on mine for a moment. On the postcard propped against a book, a bowl of glossy apples overflows in 2-dimensional abundance. There are shadowy curves of deep red and highlights of pale green. Between them are many colors that I cannot name. Some remind me of fall leaves. Is this how green ripens into red? Is this fruit or is it light? My pencil rubs ever so gently on the page, spreading a small patch of pale green. There, I have set a trap to catch the light. The sound of my breathing, the slow, hollow ticking of the Russian clock, the soft scratching of pencil on paper. It is summer in the city, the last summer of high school, the first summer of my life that I'm not tearing through the orchards and scrambling over rocks at Abdulabad. 2 mornings a week, Mr. Mossavari comes, an hour each time, to teach me how to draw. He has studied art in Europe. He used to teach at the Fine Arts College, where my cousin Parveen is a student, and she had arranged for my sister Mary to take private lessons with him. Now Mary is gone, and our village summers are suspended, too painful for my mother to want to return yet. A beautiful landscape that Mary did in pastels hangs on the wall, a record of sister and summer. I couldn't possibly have as much talent as Mary, my mother says, but Mr. Mossavari will help to fill the long, idle days and keep me out of trouble. When he looks at my drawing and exclaims, "Excellent," at first I hear sarcasm. He must be making fun of me. But no, the smile is genuine. You have a fine hand, an observant eye. Such compliments from a teacher are strange to me. Until now, no teacher has ever seen in me anything but a stubborn adversary. Stranger still, the compliments keep coming. Their regularity does not dim their warmth. Their predictability makes them no less precious. I copy postcard after postcard, apples and pear, roses, lilacs, hyacinths, lilies, plum blossoms. Lovely, you have captured it perfectly, an elegant line, a subtle sense of color. Each phrase echoes long in my mind, over and over. I am hungry to grasp every possible nuance of those words. But I can't look at the words, and it would be wrong to stare at Mr. Mossavari. So instead, I look more closely at the postcard. One day he brings me a very different postcard. This is to look at only, not to copy. A picture of a woman in calm composure, but with a strange, shadowy, ambiguous expression. "This is Mona Lisa," he says, as if introducing me to an old friend. "You know, your smile is exactly like hers. See how the lips turn at the corner and this little depression here?" When he gathers his pencils and cards at the end of our hour, says his goodbyes and closes the door behind him, I head straight for the mirror. I tense the corners of my mouth into a smile, just a little smile, and look hard for the mysterious shadow to appear. What does he mean by a little depression? Who is this Mona Lisa? Will I be a better artist if I look like her? From Mr. Mossavari and the constrained exercise of copying postcards, I learned that art was not just something that happened at school, filling an hour more pleasantly than math or grammar. Art was something that I, Monir Farmanfarmaian, could do, and much to my surprise, I could do it well. It was within reach, as close as the tip of my pencil, much closer than nursing wounded soldiers or steering heavy metal through the sky.
Fortunately, I was far too ignorant of the world to replace my nurse or my pilot with any bohemian caricature of an artist. It wasn't so much that I wanted to be an artist. Art was simply the doing. Simply, innocently, the dance of my pencil over the page. This is in the middle of World War II, and she takes it upon herself to decide that she's going to Paris to study art. And it's not so easy to get to Paris from Iran in the middle of World War II. But she meets some people who make some connections, and she finds that she can go to the United States. And so she'll go there first and wait till the war is over and then go to Paris. And she manages to do this without telling her parents until the very last minute when her father has to sign some papers that she's already arranged at the embassy. And she manages to get passage on a ship that is carrying prisoners of war. She just engineers this whole thing as, still basically a teenager, with incredible resourcefulness. And there's a piece of Monir that is just so down to earth and practical. And she would be as creative in solving the most everyday problems as she was in her art. And nothing would stop her. She would just find a solution somehow. And it's one of the things I very much love about her, that very clear sense of practicality. And you get it when she's talking about the art. She really always focuses on the materials, the technique, just the practical challenges. She never talks about the deeper inspirations, or she did later in her life, but she learned that that's what people sometimes wanted answers about. But really, if you just let her lead the conversation, she would talk about just how to make it, how to do it, how to make it. So she lands in New York as an art student in 1945, and just by force of personality and some good luck, she finds herself in the art scene, the 10th Street Club, the Cedar Tavern, Woodstock, and she is meeting many, many artists that will become important. And she's being treated as this exotic little thing, not taken seriously as an artist, but she learns how to play the social thing, and she also is studying very, very hard. She studied at Cornell and Parsons, and she focused a lot on fashion because she was married to an artist, and she understood that somebody has to pay the bills, and so that was the more practical side of art. And it came to things like doing fashion illustration, working at Bonwit Teller side by side with Andy Warhol when he was doing shoe drawings. So it was just an interesting time in New York, and the art practice in the same way. I'll read you just a bit. This is a scene from Woodstock, where she and her husband Manzanar are staying. In half of the living room, we set up a studio where Manzanar worked on weekends. During the week, I coached Dora in her painting as best I could, echoing the phrases I had heard from my teachers at Parsons. In the quiet of the long afternoons, while her child was napping, Dora would pose for me in the nude. Her body had a swan-like beauty with a long neck and a floating grace that I never tired of drawing. When Dora tired of posing, though, I did small sketches of the landscape in pen and ink, or drew the flowers that grew wild beside the mountain pathways, dogwoods and lilies, irises, buttercups, and daisies. It was the beginning of an easy habit that would follow me the rest of my life, like a loyal seeing-eye dog, a sketchbook, a bottle of ink, 3 pens, and sometimes a brush. I found that I could look at a flower very carefully and trust my hand to follow in a spontaneous line from the top of the page to the bottom. When I looked at the drawing, complete even as I saw it for the first time, Usually I was pleased to see that somehow it had worked. The anatomy was true. The dance of thin lines and thicker lines captured the tissue of petals, the tease and flounce and swirl of their skirts, and the certainty of deep rhythms in the shape of all plants. If I was successful, the flower traced in ink on my pad was latif. No single word in English fulfills the sense of the Persian, hovering between delicate, sensitive, graceful, and precise. Latif. Always there were flowers, but not only flowers. I might dwell for a while with the honest trunk of a tree, the map of runnelled bark and the knobby knees of knots, or exposed roots like the fingers of an old woman. Leaves conforming and unique, as much alike and unalike as human faces. The sleek, side-eyed arcs and angles of a bird's body, the sweep of wings, the way a squirrel's tail listens with a taut curl. So she manages to extricate herself from that marriage, which was a bad marriage, and really kept her from realizing her own self as an artist, and was living in New York and gaining some independence financially and very pleased with herself and raising her daughter and very happy just as she was when she met Venerable Farmanfarmaian, who was then a law student from a very, very prominent, very wealthy Iranian family that had been deeply connected with the previous royal family. He courts her very slowly, gently, carefully, takes her on a trip back to Iran, and finally convinces her to marry him. And this whole new piece of her life begins, where the family that she marries into is so powerful and prominent and so old-fashioned that she's really, she's a renegade. And there's lots of subtle conflict, and it's really, in some ways, probably why she wanted to keep the book a secret, because she could not deal with their responses to her. But it's also this incredible opportunity where she has the freedom, the support, the love of her husband, and just a free rein to do what she would like to do creatively and to explore her roots. And it's a time when she started working with Point 4, an American program that was, after World War II, set up to try and modernize industries in various countries. And so she was working to explore the traditional crafts and see how they could be better adapted for international markets. And in the beginning, that set her off on just traveling all around the country, searching for the traditional arts, which were not recognized then as having any value. And she got into architectural salvage, the very beautiful painted interiors of the homes that she had grown up in of that era, and the carved wooden windows, and so much beauty was being taken apart and just dismantled and replaced by modern buildings. And coffee house paintings that were used for storytelling, for religious storytelling, entertainment, old epic stories, and they were very much part of the working class culture. Or the tribal jewelry, the Turkoman silver, horse decorations, and personal ornaments. But all these things were just, they'd show up in junk shops, and she recognized the value, and just went straight to the source and traveled as much as she possibly could, collecting, and put these things on the map. And in many, many ways, what she did for Iranian traditional arts is every much as valuable as what she's done as in her own individual right as an artist. And that was also when I met her, and those collection trips were the ones that I was following behind. And let me see. I want to read you a part, from the, where she first gets involved in the mirror work. And she'd already been working on painting, reverse painting behind glass, which was traditional in the decorative work that was used in upper class homes. But then she also discovered, and that was an extension of the flower paintings and such. Sorry. There's so much. How am I doing for time? Okay. Then let me slow down and. So the other aspect of this life that her husband offered her was that her home became a canvas for her art. And much of what she was exploring in terms of the architectural salvage or the garden she was creating, and her interest in textiles and fabric art, all of this was being, the stage for it was her home. And the garden led back to flower paintings, and the flower paintings led to monotypes and reverse art, reverse glass painting, in a way that connects back with the tradition in a strange and interesting way. And I want to read a bit of that. So she's had an exhibition of paintings of flowers that were inspired by working in the garden. After all the fuss, I went back to my rooftop studio, now suddenly quiet as if with anticipation. What could I do next? I made a few more monotypes on glass, working from sheer habit. Once, after I lifted a print and picked up the glass to move it to another table, I realized that the image seen from behind the glass itself was quite lovely, with the brush texture of the flowers showing semi-translucent. I started to play with painting behind glass. I propped up a sheet of glass and built the image in reverse, twisting one arm around the back of the image, or on larger pieces, moving back and forth to see the effects of my brush strokes. I tried a few on very thick sheets of glass that added a new depth and brilliance to the colors. Sometimes I added backgrounds of gold and silver leaf behind the flowers. I experimented with monotypes printed from one piece of glass to another. When I pressed with the palm of my hand, the paint sandwiched between the two sheets of glass spread in abstract organic tendrils, blending in jewel colors like an undersea dream. The materials themselves were leading me, but at the same time I was being pulled by the memory of paintings behind glass from the Qajar period that I had seen in antique shops or in the old homes that Javad Agha showed me in Qazvin. I started to collect these antique paintings on glass, making expeditions as a break from experimenting in the studio. Many of them were familiar stylized flowers and nightingales, or fish that promised good luck in a dry land. There were landscapes too, and paintings of famous buildings from earlier centuries with primitive attempts at perspective. Many were portraits of the Qajar court. I recognized their features from other paintings on canvas. I found an especially fine portrait on glass of the infamously beautiful Princess Taj al-Sultaneh. And this, the that she's describing of this traditional art is very much the upper class, the court and the noble homes. But she discovers another form of reverse glass painting that touches her every bit as much. And I think it's just an interesting comparison. Many of the roads I traveled around Iran began as a path traced by a finger through dust on some obscure object in an antique dealer's shop. Tehran's antique shops in those days had none of the polite polish that the term might suggest, but tended rather to shadowy cubbyholes of eccentric hodgepodge. Among moth-eaten needlework and rusty dervishes' axes and padlocks forged in fanciful shapes and hand-copied Qurans and Afghan pistols and Russian bric-a-brac might be found articles of mysterious function and provenance, any one of them the starting point for a shaggy dog story served up by the proprietor with glasses of tea. I cultivated relationships with a handful of dealers who came to know my taste and alerted me to any promising new find. One of them, Valiollah, became a good friend. It was his rag that wiped the grime from a sheet of glass to reveal a primitive but beautiful painting, and another, and another. He had come back from a trip to the Persian Gulf Coast with a whole stack of paintings behind glass. Brilliant folk art in Matisse-like colors, these were poor country cousins of the Qajar paintings behind glass. Instead of portraying decorative flowers and nightingales, most of the paintings were large-eyed portraits. A few were scenes from religious stories that reminded me of the coffeehouse paintings. There were peacocks, too, and prophets on horseback. They were flat and coarse, drawn in heavy black lines that were completely formulaic, even traced from the same template. But somehow each face was alive with expression, and the colors were unique to each and boldly eccentric. I traveled with Valiollah to the southern coast by the Strait of Hormuz, where he had found the paintings. It was a world apart from the rest of Iran, tropically humid, with marshes and mangrove forests lining the shore. In ancient fishing villages, women with their faces hidden behind stiff black masks looked out to sea, where their men tossed nets from high-prowed sailboats against a backdrop of oil tankers and battleships queuing through the strait. In tent encampments, the most makeshift of slums, on the outskirts of the ports of Minab, Bandar Abbas, and Khorramshahr, the glass paintings served as humble decoration. They hung by a strip of fabric from a nail in a tent post, frames skewed and splitting, the glass fly-specked, greasy with cooking smoke, and coated with the dust that blew through the tents. The paintings were 40 or 50 years old at the most, a very brief fashion in the time span of traditional arts, and one that was disappearing fast as the paintings were sold off for a pittance and replaced with poster prints of religious images or photographs of the Shah. We found a painter who still made a small living from his art. His brother, who had also painted, had recently died, and he himself was half blind, one eye glued shut. He worked on the dirt floor at the back of a shop where his wife sold cigarettes and odds and ends. Bending over the glass with brush in hand, he traced the lines from a drawing placed beneath the glass and then blocked in the colors, shocking pinks, purples, blazing orange, and brilliant green. An apprentice, a boy of about 14, sat to one side, mixing powdered pigments into a paste and wiping clean the panes of glass. The artist identified the woman in the portrait. "It is Tuba Khanum. I have painted her 100 times. That was all he would say about Tuba Khanum, and I was left to imagine their story. Over a few years, I collected about 1,600 glass paintings from the Gulf, buying almost anything that was offered for sale. My patronage no doubt prolonged the life of the tradition artificially for a few years, but I saw no harm in that. And so you have all these different pieces, the painting behind glass, and I want to talk now about her first experiences with the mirror work. which I think becomes, all these pieces come together, and the culmination is what you see upstairs. With the excitement of the Senate Commission behind me, I continued painting behind glass. A couple of years later, the mirrors entered my life, this time in dazzling force. Marcia Hafif and Robert Morris, the minimalist artists, had come to Iran for a visit, and I offered to take them sightseeing. We went to Shiraz, the city of poets in the ancient heartland of Pars. At the Shah Cheragh mine, Marcia and I donned chadors, and the three of us sat for hours in a high-domed hall that was covered entirely, every inch of every surface, in a mosaic of tiny mirrors cut into hexagons, squares, and triangles, each piece set at a slightly different angle. The very space seemed on fire, and lamps blazing in hundreds of thousands of reflections. I imagined myself standing inside a many-faceted diamond and looking out at the sun. Women came and went, ethereal in white chadors, trailing children awed into silence. The motions of their prayers, bowing, rising, prostrating, echoed in angled fragments. Splashes of color rippled like jagged lightning across the walls and domed ceiling. It was a universe unto itself, architecture transformed into performance, all movement and fluid light, all solids fractured and dissolved in brilliance, in space, in prayer. I was overwhelmed. I had seen mirror mosaics of Shah Cheragh before, as well as those in the shrine at Mashhad and the Golestan Palace in Tehran, and they were often used in a smaller way on trim and molding in the old Qajar homes. But I had never experienced them with such intensity as I did that day in Shiraz. The art had originated a couple of centuries ago when the aristocracy began to import mirrors from Venice. Too often the mirrors arrived in pieces, so craftsmen salvaged the fragments and used them in much the same way as they worked with tile mosaics. I came home from Shiraz, fired up with ideas, determined to bring the mirror mosaics into my own work. I poured my enthusiasm out to Abul. Of course, it will be easy, he said. Not so, I thought. But Abul was intrigued by the technical challenge. When he learned that a friend was building a new home using mirror mosaic in a traditional way for the decoration, he arranged for us to visit the building in progress. We found a man sitting on the floor, cutting mirrors into tiny pieces with the speed and assurance of a lifetime of practice. His two assistants were setting the glittering pieces into wet plaster directly on the wall. The man cutting mirrors stood up to greet us, and the owner of the home introduced him as Haji Ostad Muhammad Naveed. Haji because he had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and Ostad, which means teacher, because he was recognized as a master craftsman. Few meetings have been so important in my life. Haji Ostad immediately became my teacher. I asked about the medium he used as a base. He explained how they killed the plaster by kneading it for hours so that it would stay pliable instead of setting hard immediately. He showed me the serish, a liquid brown glue made from the pounded root of a tree that they added to the plaster to further slow its setting. It was also used in bookbinding, he told me. It smelled foul. I asked if he would come to my studio when his work on the house was finished and teach me more about his craft. He put his hand on his chest and politely made modest excuses. In the end, he agreed to come, but it wasn't easy. He was a very religious man and wasn't comfortable working for a woman. His usual clients, the sort of people who could afford to decorate a room with mirror mosaics, were men of exceptional wealth and old-fashioned tastes. Haji Ostad was puzzled, to say the least, by what I wanted him to do. I quickly gave up on the idea of asking him to teach me to cut the mirrors myself. This was master's work that he had done since the age of 7, and even his assistants were no match for him. The mirror he used was unusually fine, specially made in Belgium for the Iranian market, and half the gauge of the thinnest mirror found in America. Haji Ostad could cut it like butter, producing strips so narrow and long that they bent under their own weight like stalks of grass when I placed a handful in a vase. I gave him patterns on paper, stars, triangles, strips, and crescents, and asked him to cut 20 of these, 100 of those. I gave him also some of the abstract paintings behind glass I had done, and asked him to cut those in pieces. He was mystified, but curious enough to continue. For a long time, I pondered the problem of how to create a frame or a base that would hold the plaster and mirrors independent of a wall. Abel was eager to help and came up with the idea of using steel frames around a steel mesh to hold the plaster in place. I made the first few pieces on those frames, but they were too heavy to be practical. It took 3 or 4 men to lift the finished artwork when the steel was covered with plaster and glass. Then I happened to visit a factory owned by a friend who was starting production of plastic chairs molded from an epoxy mixture. He had asked me to look at the process and see if I might contribute some designs. The epoxy was noxious stuff, but I thought somehow it might be useful, so I begged a couple of cans to experiment with. I mixed the chemicals and spread the mess on a piece of plywood, hoping it would serve as a base to hold the plaster. Haji Ostad shook his head. It will never work. The surface is too smooth. So I tried again, this time strewing coarse sand on the epoxy before it set. This might do, said Haji Ostad, still looking doubtful. I also bought a big jar of Elmer's glue and suggested that we might mix it into the plaster instead of sirish. Haji Ostad was pleased. The glue worked well, it didn't smell, and it was much easier to handle. With all the pieces finally at hand, I began to compose, building images spontaneously from fragments of mirror and painted glass. I incorporated small fragments also from some of the Qajar paintings on glass that had broken, a glimpse of a nightingale, a few petals of a flower, a fish swimming through waves of glass. Something new, something old, all swirling together in a dazzle of light and color and unpredictable angles. Haji Ostad couldn't quite believe it was working. Every so often he would pick up a piece we had finished a few weeks before and shake it to see if anything fell off, then shake his head in disbelief. His reluctance to work for me faded gradually. It didn't hurt that I paid him whatever he asked, and his price crept up every few weeks. Okay. Khanum, Dr. Fallah has asked me to work at his house. He's offering me 10 tamang more than you're paying. Don't go, Haji Ostad. I'll pay you as much as he will. Thank you, Khanum. Never mind. You're worth it. No one else can do such beautiful work as you do. Yes, Khanum. Thank you. Haji Ostad's coming and going through the bedroom to the rooftop studio was awkward, so Abel had another stairway built outside. Finally, we outgrew that room and built a much larger studio in the garden, where Haji Ostad set up quite a camp. With his assistance, there were sometimes as many as 7 or 8 of us working together, especially later when we did some large installations. I saw to it that tea was served throughout the day, with cakes at 10 o'clock and a big lunch for everyone. 2 of his workers smoked opium and would droop a little at intervals, but Haji Ostad would wake them up with a shout. Ahmed Agha, get up, it's time for work, no snoozing. When I was confident of Haji Ostad's support and comfortable with the technique, I decided to work on a larger scale and return to the architectural roots of the art. I did the ceilings of my daughter's bedrooms and the wall of our fireplace. The work was admired by family and friends, which led to many commissions. Another fireplace for Abel's brother, a ceiling for a friend, 2 walls and columns for the Intercontinental Hotel, 2 more for the Farhangsara Cultural Center. I call them commissions, but I was rarely paid. The business skills I had learned in order to survive as a designer in New York seemed to vanish when they were no longer needed. With Abel's support, I needed nothing, and it seemed inappropriate to ask for money from friends. On the contrary, I felt a responsibility to support other artists, and I bought far more than I could possibly hang in my home, bought like a collector, simply to show my appreciation. But it bothered me, in a quiet way, that my own work did not seem to deserve the same respect. It was as if my marriage had automatically conferred on me the status of a dilettante, and I feared my art would never be taken seriously. I think to be here at this exhibition, to see her art taken seriously, I sure wish Monir was here to see it. And I think enough of me, if you'd like to ask questions. Go ahead. Okay. Yes?
It was awesome.
Thank you.
I'm from Iran, you know, and you name the city so well. Every city you named, it was awesome.
Thank you.
You took me back to the country, and this was awesome. Thank you.
I wish we could go back, but
How long were they in Iran with her second husband?
they went back in 1957, and then they left in the middle of the revolution. Not planning to move, but they went on a vacation and realized that they could not go back. And then she went back much later, in her 80s, when she realized that the political pressure had faded in terms of her family's identity. And she was just much more comfortable there and could work again with the craftsmen. And it was easier to get health insurance. It was an easier place to age.
What about her children? Did they ever get involved with her art? Or?
They've been involved with their own art. She has 2 daughters, and certainly the younger Zara is very much an artist. Her older daughter raises horses, I think, in Montana. Yeah. Yes?
Did she have any connection with the Shah or no?
Well, she moved in similar social circles, and there's a description in the book of when they're invited to a gathering at the palace, and the Shah was into parlor games, and they actually played Twister. and she had a commission to do a mirror installation at the palace in the Queen's bedroom. But politically, she was sort of at arm's length. But it was her family, her husband's family was very close. Yeah.
How did her husband's family feel about the memoir she had kept secret?
I have kept a low profile. I don't know. The younger members of the family have been very responsive, and but they're people that are involved in the arts and living in New York. I don't know how the ones that she was really worried about feel.